The rain had stopped an hour ago, but the parking garage still smelled like wet concrete and diesel fumes when Adrien Voss opened his eyes at 4:47 in the morning, his neck stiff against the folded hoodie he used as a pillow, his daughter's stuffed rabbit tucked under his elbow because he'd promised her he would keep it safe while she stayed at her grandmother's for the week. He didn't know, as he blinked at the fogged-up windows of his aging sedan, that in less than 3 hours a woman worth $400 million would be standing outside that very door with tears sliding down her face, her hand pressed flat against the cold glass like she was trying to reach through it and pull him out of the life that had swallowed him whole. If you believe in kindness, in second chances, and in stories that remind us we are never as invisible as we feel, hit that like button right now, drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from tonight, share this with someone who needs a little hope today, and subscribe to Oxley Stories so you never miss the next story that might just change how you see the person struggling quietly beside you. Adrien was 34 years old and had once worn a suit to work every day, back when he had a corner cubicle at a mid-sized logistics firm and a wife named Renee who used to leave sticky notes on the bathroom mirror telling him she loved him before he left for the office. That life had ended 18 months ago, not with a dramatic explosion but with a slow unraveling, Renee's diagnosis, the medical bills that ate through their savings like acid, the funeral that cost more than he thought a person could spend on flowers and a wooden box, and then the layoffs that came 6 weeks later when the company restructured and decided single fathers with erratic schedules were expendable. He had a daughter named Mila, 7 years old, with her mother's stubborn curls and a habit of asking questions that cut straight through any lie he tried to tell her, and he had exactly one goal left in the world: keep a roof over her head, even if that roof, some nights, was the ceiling of his car. He hadn't planned on it becoming a pattern. The first night he slept in the sedan, he told himself it was temporary, just until the next paycheck from the warehouse job cleared, just until he caught up on the motel bill. But temporary things have a way of calcifying into permanent ones when you're poor, and somewhere between the second month and the sixth, sleeping in the driver's seat with the seat reclined as far as it would go became simply what nights were. He kept Mila with her grandmother, Dolores, 3 days a week under the story that Daddy's new apartment wasn't quite ready yet, and he took every extra shift he could get loading pallets at a distribution center off Route 9, showering at a 24-hour gym membership he'd bought specifically because it had showers, washing his one good shirt in gas station bathroom sinks so he'd look presentable enough to keep applying for jobs that required him to look like a man who hadn't been sleeping. In a Honda. That morning, the morning that would change everything, Adrien had parked in the underground garage beneath Holloway Tower, a gleaming glass building downtown that housed the corporate headquarters of Solmark Industries, because a friend from the warehouse had mentioned that the garage attendants didn't check for overnight parking violations before 6 a.m. and it was warmer than the open lot by the highway. He didn't know that the CEO of Solmark, a woman named Vivian Castel, had a habit of arriving absurdly early, sometimes before dawn, because sleep had never come easily to her since she'd clawed her way up from an assistant's desk to the top floor over the course of 11 relentless years, and mornings were the only hours when the building felt like it belonged to her instead of to the shareholders. Vivian was 39, sharp-eyed, immaculately put together even at 5 in the morning, the kind of woman who intimidated men twice her size in boardrooms without raising her voice. She had built Solmark's logistics division from a struggling subsidiary into the company's most profitable arm, and she had done it by being the first person in the building and the last one to leave, sacrificing a marriage along the way that had quietly dissolved 2 years earlier, her ex-husband telling her in their final conversation that she loved spreadsheets more than she loved people, a comment she'd never fully forgiven herself for, because some nights, alone in her enormous apartment, with a view of a city she'd conquered and couldn't feel, she wondered if he'd been right. That morning she pulled her black sedan into her reserved spot on level 2, and as she stepped out, gathering her coat against the pre-dawn chill, she noticed something 2 rows over, a car with condensation fogging every window, a battered gray hoodie visible pressed against the glass, and what looked, unmistakably, like a person curled up in the driver's seat. Her first instinct, honed by a decade of corporate caution, was to walk past it and let security handle whatever this was. But something made her pause. Maybe it was the stuffed rabbit she could just make out on the dashboard, its ear pressed against the windshield as though it, too, were trying to keep watch. Maybe it was the way the man's face, even in sleep, looked exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with one bad night. She stood there for almost a full minute before she made her decision, and if you've ever had a moment where your feet moved before your mind caught up, where compassion simply overrode every rule you'd built your life around, you already understand what happened next. Vivian walked over, and instead of knocking on the window like a security guard would, she reached out and rested her palm gently against the glass, close to where his head lay, and she stood there a moment longer, watching a stranger sleep in a corporate garage, feeling something crack open in her chest that she hadn't expected and couldn't immediately name. Adrien woke slowly, the way people who haven't slept properly in months always do, disoriented and defensive before his eyes even focused. When he saw a woman in a cream-colored blazer standing outside his window, tears visible on her face even through the fog, his stomach dropped with a familiar, exhausting shame. He knew this moment. He had lived versions of it before, at gas stations, in parking lots, the moment when someone realizes what they're looking at and the pity arrives before the person even has a chance to explain themselves. He fumbled to sit upright, smoothing down his hair, already forming the apology he'd rehearsed a dozen times before, the one about how he was just resting, just taking a break, nothing to worry about, sir or ma'am, he'd be moving along. But Vivian didn't step back. She knocked softly, not the sharp rap of security but something gentler, almost apologetic, and when he cracked the window, she asked if he was all right, and her voice cracked slightly on the question in a way that surprised them both. Adrien, guarded, told her he was fine, that he must have dozed off on his way to an early shift, a lie so thin it barely qualified as one. Vivian's eyes moved to the back seat, where a duffel bag sat beside a small rolling suitcase covered in faded cartoon stickers, the kind of stickers a little girl picks out herself, and beside it, folded with visible care despite everything, a child's cardigan. She asked, quietly, if he had a daughter. Adrien's jaw tightened, and for a moment he considered denying it, considered protecting the last shred of privacy he had left, but something about the way this stranger was looking at him, without judgment, without the practiced disgust he'd grown used to from people who saw homelessness and assumed laziness, made the truth slip out before he could stop it. He told her about Mila. He told her, haltingly at first and then in a rush he couldn't control, about Renee, about the hospital bills, about the layoff, about the motel that had become unaffordable, about Dolores keeping Mila 3 nights a week so the girl wouldn't have to know her father slept in a car, about the gym membership he kept just for the showers, about the interviews he'd gone to in a shirt he'd ironed with the flat of his palm because he didn't own an iron anymore. Vivian listened without interrupting, and when he finally stopped, embarrassed at how much he'd said to a total stranger at 5 in the morning, she didn't offer him pity, and she didn't offer him money, not yet, because she understood instinctively that a man holding onto the last scraps of his dignity does not want a check pressed into his hand by someone who's never known hunger. Instead, she asked him what kind of work he was good at, and something about the specificity of the question, the way it treated him as a person with skills rather than a problem to be solved, made him sit up a little straighter. He told her about his background in logistics coordination, about the systems he used to manage at his old job, about the fact that he'd been quietly teaching himself supply chain software at the public library on his days off because he refused to let his mind go soft even while his circumstances crumbled around him. Vivian, who ran the logistics division of one of the largest supply chain companies in the region, felt something click into place that had nothing to do with charity and everything to do with recognizing a person whose talent had simply run out of road. She asked him to come upstairs. Not to a shelter, not to a charity office, but to the 22nd floor of Holloway Tower, to Salmark's own building, and Adrien, suspicious, exhausted, and half convinced this was some elaborate prelude to humiliation, almost said no. But there was Mila's rabbit on the dashboard, and there was the memory of Renee telling him once, in the last months of her illness, that pride was a luxury they could no longer afford, and so he followed this stranger in the cream blazer into an elevator that smelled like nothing he'd smelled in months, clean and quiet and warm. What Adrien didn't know yet, and what the viewers watching this story right now are about to learn alongside him, was that Vivian Castell had grown up harder than her tailored suits and her corner office suggested. She had been raised by a single mother who cleaned office buildings at night, the very kind of buildings Vivian now owned, and there had been a winter, when Vivian was 9, when their heat had been shut off for 3 weeks and she and her mother had slept under every blanket they owned in the same bed just to stay warm. She remembered the particular cold of that winter every single day of her adult life, and she had promised herself, back when she was a scared, undersized assistant photocopying reports for executives who didn't know her name, that if she ever climbed high enough to matter, she would never walk past someone the way people had so often walked past her mother. In her office, which had floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking a city waking up in gray morning light, Vivian poured Adrien a coffee from a machine that cost more than his car, and she asked him to walk her through, in detail, how he would redesign a delivery routing system if he were given the chance. Adrien, still off balance, still half expecting to be escorted out by security at any moment, began talking, tentatively at first, then with the gathering confidence of a man remembering he used to be good at something. He sketched ideas on a legal pad she slid toward him, talked about inefficiencies he'd noticed even from the outside, about how warehouse staff were routinely mismanaged in ways that cost companies thousands of dollars a week in wasted labor, about systems he'd designed for fun, just to keep his mind sharp, systems nobody had asked him to build. Vivian listened with the focus she usually reserved for board presentations, and when he finished, she told him something that would replay in his mind for the rest of his life, that talent like his didn't belong in a warehouse loading dock, and it certainly didn't belong sleeping in a parking garage 2 floors beneath her office while she signed off on multi-million-dollar contracts. She offered him a position, not a token job, not charity dressed up as employment, but a real role in her logistics division, one that came with a salary that would have seemed like fantasy to him 3 hours earlier, full benefits, and, crucially, an advance on his first paycheck specifically so he could put down a deposit on an actual apartment that very week. Adrien sat frozen for a long moment, his hands wrapped around a coffee cup he'd forgotten to drink from, and then, without warning, the exhaustion of 18 months broke through every wall he'd built to survive it, and he put his face in his hands and wept, not delicately, not performatively, but the raw, heaving sobs of a man who has been holding himself together with nothing but sheer will for far too long and has finally been allowed to put the weight down. Vivian didn't reach for him, didn't try to fix the moment or rush him out of it. She simply sat with him in silence, letting him cry, because she remembered what it had felt like, all those years ago, to finally be seen after a long stretch of being invisible, and she understood that sometimes the kindest thing a person can do is not speak at all. When he finally composed himself, embarrassed but lighter somehow, he asked her, voice still rough, why she was doing this, why a woman who ran a company worth hundreds of millions of dollars would stop her morning to help a stranger sleeping in her parking garage instead of calling security like anyone else in her position would have. Vivian was quiet for a moment before she told him about the winter she was 9 years old, about her mother's exhausted hands, about the promise she'd made to herself in a cold apartment decades ago. She told him that success without memory is just cruelty wearing a nice suit, and she had spent 11 years making sure she never became the kind of person who forgot where she came from. The story could have ended there, with a job offer and a moment of shared humanity, and it would have already been enough to move anyone watching. But real change is rarely a single afternoon, and the following weeks tested both of them in ways neither expected. Adrien's first days at Soulmark were harder than he anticipated, not because of the work, which came to him with the ease of a man finally using muscles he'd been forced to atrophy, but because of the whispers. Word travels fast in an office building, and within days, murmurs circulated about the man the CEO had personally hired off the street, some of it curious, some of it unkind, a few junior executives making pointed comments in the break room about diversity hires and charity cases loud enough for Adrien to hear. There was a man named Preston Adler in the finance department, ambitious and threatened by anyone he perceived as a shortcut to advancement, who took it upon himself to make Adrien's transition as difficult as possible, questioning his qualifications in meetings, forwarding emails to colleagues with snide commentary attached, once even suggesting in a leadership meeting, loud enough that it reached Vivian's office by the end of the day, that hiring someone off the literal street set a dangerous precedent for the company's standards. Adrien, who had survived worse than office politics, kept his head down and let his work speak, staying late to perfect proposals, arriving early not because he had nowhere else to sleep anymore but because he wanted to prove, to himself as much as anyone, that he belonged in the room. Meanwhile, Mila remained with her grandmother, and Adrien visited her every evening now instead of the exhausted, guilty phone calls he used to make from the front seat of his car. The first night he brought her to see the small one-bedroom apartment he'd secured with the advance Vivian had given him, Mila ran through the empty rooms in her socks, her laughter echoing off bare walls in a way that made Adrien sit down on the floor of the empty living room and cry for the second time in 2 weeks, this time from something closer to joy than grief. He told her they were going to be okay now, and for the first time in a year and a half, he believed his own words when he said them. But the tension at Solmark reached a breaking point when Preston, digging for ammunition, discovered records of Adrien's brief stint of homelessness and, rather than seeing a story of resilience, framed it in a memo to the board as a liability, questioning whether someone with such an unstable recent history should be trusted with sensitive logistics data and vendor relationships. He circulated it just before a major quarterly review, timing it to embarrass Vivian in front of the board and cast doubt on her judgment as CEO, a calculated move meant to undercut her authority as much as it was meant to push Adrien out. Vivian, standing in the boardroom that day, could have distanced herself from Adrien to protect her own position. It would have been easy, politically safe, the kind of move that would have satisfied the board and left her reputation untouched. Instead, she stood in front of the room and told them, calmly and without a trace of apology, that she had built her entire career finding value where others saw only risk, that Adrien Voss had, in 6 weeks, redesigned a routing system that was projected to save the company over $2 million annually, and that if the board's concern was about judgment, they should examine the judgment of anyone willing to discard a person's future over a temporary hardship rather than the actual results. Sitting in front of them on the quarterly report, she looked directly at Preston as she said that instability was rarely a character flaw, that it was, more often than not, simply what happened to good people when the world stopped giving them a fair chance, and that she would rather run a company that gave people that chance back than one that congratulated itself for never having to. The room was silent when she finished, and by the end of that quarter, Adrien's routing redesign had been implemented company-wide, the savings even higher than projected, and Preston, whose own numbers had quietly been underperforming for months behind a wall of office politics, found himself on much thinner ice than he had ever intended for anyone else. If this story has touched your heart even a little, if it's made you think about the person you passed on the street today, or the coworker who seems tired in a way that isn't just about sleep, please take a moment right now to like this video, leave a comment sharing what part moved you the most, and share it with someone in your life who could use a reminder that kindness still exists in places we least expect it, because stories like Adrien's only reach the people who need them most when we choose to pass them forward. Adrien and Vivian's relationship, over the following months, grew into something neither of them had anticipated the morning she found him sleeping in that parking garage. It began simply, coffee meetings that ran longer than necessary, conversations about work that drifted into conversations about loss, about Renee, about Vivian's mother who had passed away 3 years earlier without ever seeing her daughter's corner office, about the particular loneliness of surviving something so hard that most people around you can't understand it even when they try. Mila, ever perceptive in the way that children who have lived through hardship often are, met Vivian for the first time at a company picnic and, with the blunt honesty of a 7-year-old, asked her directly if she was going to be her friend now, and Vivian, who had spent 11 years being feared in boardrooms and had almost forgotten what it felt like to be looked at with simple, uncomplicated hope, knelt down to Mila's eye level and told her that she would like that very much. There is a particular kind of grace in watching two people who have both known profound loss find their way, slowly and without force, back toward the possibility of trust, and that is exactly what happened over the year that followed. It wasn't a fairy tale rescue, not really, because Adrien never stopped working for what he built. Vivian had opened a door, but he was the one who walked through it every single day, showing up, proving himself, rebuilding his life plank by plank the way he once might have rebuilt an engine. And Vivian, in turn, found something in that unlikely friendship, and eventually something more, that no boardroom victory had ever given her, the quiet, unglamorous comfort of being needed by people who had nothing to gain from her money and everything to gain from her time. A year to the day after that morning in the parking garage, Solmark held its annual charity gala, and Vivian, standing at the podium in front of the city's wealthiest executives, changed the program at the last minute. Instead of the usual remarks about quarterly growth, she told the story of a man she'd found sleeping in her own parking garage, a story many in that room had already heard whispered secondhand and distorted, and she told it fully, honestly, without softening the parts that made her own industry look complicit in his suffering. she announced, to gasps and then applause, the launch of a foundation in her mother's name that would provide emergency housing assistance and job placement specifically for single parents falling through the cracks of a system that too often mistook desperation for laziness, and she asked Adrien, sitting in the audience with Mila's small hand in his, to stand, not as a cautionary tale, but as proof of what happens when someone simply refuses to look away. Mila, sitting beside her father in a small navy dress Dolores had bought her for the occasion, tugged on his sleeve as the room applauded and asked him, in the innocent way children ask the questions adults are too afraid to voice, whether this meant they would never have to sleep in the car again. Adrien pulled her close, his throat too tight to speak for a moment, and told her that no, they never would, not because someone had saved them out of pity, but because someone had simply seen them, all of them, the exhaustion and the fear and the stubborn, quiet dignity underneath it, and had chosen, in one ordinary 5 a.m. moment, not to walk past. Before we close this story tonight, I want to ask something special of you. If you have ever been the person sleeping in the car, metaphorically or literally, if you have ever been the one who stopped to help someone the world had stopped seeing, please comment the word "seen" below, just that one word, so we can see how many of you carry a piece of this story in your own life, because every single comment reminds us why we tell these stories in the first place. Adrien never forgot that Vivian had knocked on his window instead of calling security, and Vivian never forgot that Adrien had trusted a stranger enough to let her see him at his lowest, and in the years that followed, their lives braided together not through some sudden, dramatic romance manufactured for effect, but through the slow, patient accumulation of small choices, dinners that became routine, a little girl who started calling Vivian Miss Vivi, and then, eventually, something warmer, a partnership built not on rescue but on mutual recognition, two people who had both been cold once, in their own very different ways, and who had decided, together, never to let anyone freeze alone again if they could help it. If this story moved you even a little, if it reminded you that the person struggling silently beside you today might be one small act of courage away from an entirely different life, please like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, leave your thoughts in the comments below, and subscribe to Oxley Stories so you never miss another story about the quiet, unglamorous, life-changing power of simply choosing to look someone in the eye instead of looking away. Thank you for watching, and thank you for still believing, in a world that so often teaches us not to, that kindness remains the most powerful currency we have.